Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating and highly unique spiritual text by Ryuho Okawa. This book claims to deliver direct messages from the absolute highest spiritual realm, all meant to address the global chaos we're seeing today. So, whether you're deeply familiar with esoteric teachings, or you're just curious about how modern religious movements interpret world events, we're going to break down exactly what this text says, how it builds its arguments, and what it ultimately demands of its readers. Let's get right into it.
Since this book is basically an anthology of different spiritual voices, we've organized our explainer into 5 distinct parts. First, divine justice for humanity. Second, Jesus on global conflicts. Third, Yaidron's cosmic protection. Fourth, Toth on modern controversies. And finally, severe divine warnings.
Okay, part 1, divine justice for humanity, the premise of the secret doctrines. To really grasp these messages, we first need to understand how the book views itself, which is laid out heavily in its preface and afterword. It was actually published right before a massive, nationally broadcast lecture at the Saitama Super Arena. But the absolutely crucial thing here is the authority it claims. The author explicitly states that this text carries the weight of a modern Holy Bible or a Buddhist sutra. It's positioned as a direct revelation of divine justice, something it says contemporary humanity desperately needs right now to navigate our unprecedented global confusion. The preface goes a step further and defines the contents as secret doctrines. Now, what does that mean? Basically, these are esoteric teachings from the highest spiritual realm that are normally kept totally behind the curtain. The text is offering us this cosmic backstage lens on earthly controversies. It essentially argues that standard media reports, they're completely missing the true spiritual reality of what's happening globally. And to deliver this really complex warning, the text systematically presents the channeled perspectives of 3 distinct entities. First, we have Jesus, sharing his true thoughts on Christianity and modern geopolitical conflicts. Then there's Yaidron, a cosmic entity focused on cosmic devotion and spiritual defense. And finally, God Toth, who provides spiritual guidance specifically targeted at North America, tackling climate issues and modern social values. Moving on to part 2, Jesus on global conflicts, a spiritual perspective on geopolitics. We start with our first messenger, a channeled voice of Jesus, who offers some really unexpected commentary on major geopolitical crises. For instance, looking at the protests in Hong Kong, the text says Jesus expresses deep sorrow over the situation. It emphasizes the struggle of the protesters, but it frames their fight as way more than just a political movement. It's described as a desperate bid to protect religious and democratic freedoms from an oppressive, totalitarian regime. You can really see the stark contrast here between standard geopolitics and the book's spiritual perspective. A standard analysis might just look at Hong Kong as a localized clash, state police versus citizens. But this esoteric perspective, it elevates the situation to a cosmic scale. It asserts that Hong Kong literally represents the fire of freedom, and it warns that if this fire is extinguished, it won't just affect one city. It's going to trigger massive, cascading misfortune all across the globe. This cosmic, zoomed-out perspective continues when the text looks at the Middle East, specifically tensions involving Iran. Interestingly, the channeled Jesus strongly argues against using military might to dictate divine justice. So instead of picking sides in a holy war, the text suggests that a country like Japan, which sits outside the immediate religious friction of that region, should step up and act as a neutral mediator to foster understanding instead of violence. All right, part 3. Yaidron's cosmic protection, defending the faith from malicious forces. Now we shift gears to Yaidron. In the lore of this book, Yaidron is presented as a powerful cosmic protector. And this chapter is intensely focused on vigilance. Yaidron doesn't just critique the outside world, he actually delivers a really stark warning to the believers themselves. He calls the religious organization extremely naive and says they are in a highly defenseless situation. Basically, they're failing to realize that real-world ideological adversaries are actively creeping up on them. The rhetoric here gets incredibly intense and militant. Yaidron essentially asks, is it necessary to unleash a flash of lightning from the heavenly realm? Do they need to deploy spiritual electric shocks to repel these malicious forces? It's a very direct call to abandon passivity. It asks believers to embrace a kind of holy anger, to actively push back against what the text describes as evil vibrations. To fix this defenselessness, the book literally lays out a step-by-step mindset for spiritual defenders. Step 1, discard that organizational naivete. Step 2, overcome your inner doubts and what it calls weak faith. And step 3, take action. Believers are commanded to step out into various sectors of society to actively, tangibly defend their teachings and their leader.
Now for part 4, Toth on modern controversies, reevaluating climate and society.
This section is arguably the most provocative. Here, the channeled spirit of God, Toth, tackles some of the most polarizing controversies in modern society, aiming his message squarely at North America. This perfectly illustrates the massive divide between today's secular consensus and the book's esoteric framework. For example, where standard science says increased CO2 is a dangerous driver of global warming, Toth argues it might actually be a good thing. And regarding LGBT movements, which modern society largely views as an essential expansion of human rights, Toth frames them as symptoms of a purely materialistic worldview. Let's look closer at both of these claims. So, on climate change, Toth actually argues that reducing carbon emissions could be detrimental. The text asserts that higher carbon dioxide levels could promote agricultural growth, bring more rain, and literally green expanding deserts, like the Gobi Desert or arid parts of Africa. It is a complete 180 from modern environmentalism, totally driven by the text's unique spiritual logic. Then, the text pivots to a stringent, spiritually based critique of LGBT movements and same-sex marriage. Toth describes these modern values as somewhat insect-like or animalistic. Now, within the context of this book, what that means is that these movements are entirely grounded in the physical body and materialism. The argument is that they completely forget that humans exist by divine permission, totally ignoring the eternal realities of the soul, heaven, and hell. And that brings us to part 5, Severe Divine Warnings, Earth's Cosmic Evolutionary Mission. So you're probably wondering, how does this text tie all these wildly different topics, from Hong Kong to climate change to human rights, into one cohesive worldview? Well, the afterword gives us the answer. It makes it crystal clear that none of these assertions are meant to be mere political talking points. Instead, they are framed as severe divine warnings. The text insists that Earth is in the middle of a cosmic evolution, and the global chaos we see in the news, it's actually a spiritual test for humanity. According to the book, this cosmic mission means humanity has to navigate these crises in a highly specific way. We must actively resist totalitarian suppression, like we saw in Hong Kong. We must categorically reject materialism in both our environmental science and our social values. It demands we recognize the reality of the spiritual realm and its cosmic protectors. And ultimately, it says we have to align our idea of global justice solely with the Creator's intent, not human politics. And that leaves us with a final, really fascinating thought. Regardless of where you personally stand on any of these highly charged issues, how does applying this esoteric framework of cosmic evolution and divine justice fundamentally change the way we interpret modern crises? It really forces us to ask, are the conflicts we see on the news just political? Or, as this text argues, are they actually deep, spiritual battles for the future of humanity? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning. Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into something incredibly fascinating and highly specific. We are unpacking a document published by a new religious movement that claims to channel a spiritual message directly from Jesus. Now, recorded back in December of 2019, this text doesn't just, stick to abstract theology. It directly tackles major, real-world global flashpoints that were totally dominating the news cycle at the time. It offers a truly unique lens through which to view geopolitics, and we're going to break down exactly what this text argues, chapter by chapter. Right off the bat, the text establishes a core premise that sets the stakes sky high. It literally views the modern world as a battleground. But we're not talking about a war of nations or economies here, at least not at its root. According to the source, this is a fundamental clash between faith-based values on one side and the rapidly encroaching forces of materialism and atheism on the other. And, as you'll see, absolutely every geopolitical event discussed in the text is filtered through this exact dichotomy. Looking right at the source's table of contents, we can see this message is highly structured. It's actively attempting to solve 5 distinct earthly problems through a very specific spiritual lens. So it's not just a random collection of thoughts, it's a systematic, step-by-step approach to making sense of world chaos. All right, taking a quick look at our agenda, we've got a clear problem-solution arc today. We'll hit faith versus materialism, freedom in Hong Kong, traditional values in society, peace in the Middle East, and finally, evaluating the Pope.
Starting off with Section 1, Faith versus Materialism, looking back at 2019.
So, according to the text, 2019 was a massively heavy year. The channeled message highlights this intense struggle where a 2,000-year-old religion faced what it describes as a huge burden. It basically paints a picture of a massive rollback, a coordinated effort from atheistic and materialistic forces trying to actively extinguish spiritual faith across the globe. For the author, this isn't just some natural societal shift. It's a targeted spiritual offensive. Moving right along to Section 2, Freedom in Hong Kong, the Vital Indicator. To really contextualize the 2019 Hong Kong protests, the source points straight to U.S. human rights legislation, specifically calling out the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. It also brings up the territory's 150-year history under UK rule. By pulling in all this history, the text frames the resistance in the streets as far more than just a political dispute over extradition bills. It frames it as a desperate fight for survival against a dominant, secular system demanding absolute conformity. And this comparison brilliantly illustrates the core argument of the text. For the author, the Hong Kong protests aren't just political, they are a fundamental defense of religious freedom. The text sets up this direct face-off. The spiritual stance requires the uncompromising protection of human rights, while the earthly problem is this encroaching tide of atheistic governance. In this view, if you lose political freedom, you inevitably lose the freedom to believe. It's a package deal. In fact, the text issues a really stark warning on this very point. It explicitly asserts that if this fire of freedom in Hong Kong is extinguished, it won't just be an isolated local tragedy. No, it'll be the catalyst that triggers global societal misfortune. It's essentially a domino theory, but based entirely on spiritual liberty rather than traditional Cold War politics. All right, shifting gears to Section 3, Traditional Values and Society, looking specifically at opinions on LGBT issues. The spiritual message here is highly critical of modern social trends. It heavily critiques what it views as modern sexual hedonism. The text actually asserts that intermediate, fluid views on gender and sexuality are not progressive at all, but are instead leading to the formation of a new hell rather than a heavenly society. It sharply contrasts these modern movements against what it firmly considers divine order. Now, reporting this impartially, the specific stances outlined in the text are highly traditional and conservative. It strictly upholds conventional marriage and places a massive emphasis on procreation. It explicitly warns that unrestricted sexual freedom is animalistic and carries the huge risk of severe spiritual degeneration. So from this perspective, the traditional family structure isn't just a cultural norm, it is considered divinely ordained, and straying from it disrupts cosmic harmony. Next up is Section 4. Peace in the Middle East, Solving Global Conflict. Let's see how all this builds into a crucial question posed right in the Q&A section of the source material. How exactly can the Middle East find true peace without relying on the brutal military might of nations? Because the text completely rejects the idea that divine justice can be delivered through the barrel of a gun, or, through crushing economic sanctions. Instead, the text breaks down the major religions of the region to offer a strictly theological solution. It argues the true justice of God cannot be decided by military power. As you can see, it directly commands Christians and Muslims, who boast centuries of history, to respect their mutual differences and pursue peaceful dialogue. Interestingly, it also specifically directs Judaism to stop forceful territorial expansion. The ultimate message here? The cycle of conflict only ends when religious factions prioritize spiritual brotherhood over earthly territory. Which brings us to Section 5, Evaluating the Pope and the Limits of His Influence. The text points out a really fascinating paradox here. You've got the Pope with nearly 1 billion Catholic followers worldwide, right? But despite that massive flock, his actual power to stop massive nation versus nation geopolitical conflicts is severely limited. The source highlights this perceived weakness, arguing that having a huge following just doesn't automatically translate to having the authority to halt wars or check the power of aggressive secular nation-states. So, the crucial takeaway here is an uncompromising critique. The text insists, absolutely insists, that religious institutions must not bow to secular governments or economic pressures. To the author, a religious leader's job isn't diplomacy or political appeasement. Their job is to bravely and independently defend faith and fundamental human freedoms, even if that puts them at direct odds with powerful worldly empires. And finally, Section 6, our conclusion on the spiritual lens on global affairs. To wrap up today, we can really see how this channeled message provides a highly structured, though undoubtedly controversial, lens for viewing complex worldly problems. Whether it's discussing protests in the streets of Hong Kong, changing social values regarding marriage, or contested borders in the Middle East, the text consistently circles back to its core thesis. Humanity must choose faith and divine justice over material earthly force. It even introduces the concept of spiritual beings, like Yaidron, actively working behind the scenes to guard those pushing back against global materialism. It's a massive, sweeping worldview. Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on today. Regardless of your own personal beliefs or theology, how do emerging spiritual movements reshape the way millions of people process and react to our rapidly changing world? When geopolitical conflicts are viewed as literal cosmic battles, how does that change the way we search for solutions? Think about that as you scroll through the headlines tomorrow. Thanks for learning with me today, and I'll catch you in the next explainer. Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring what is essentially a literal cosmic call to arms. We're looking at Chapter 2 of a really unique spiritual text called The Spirit Message of Yaidron. Now, whether you're already deeply familiar with modern new religious movements, or you're just kind of curious about how spiritual organizations build up their theology of defense, this text offers a completely captivating look at what happens when a spiritual leader hands down some incredibly urgent esoteric directives to their followers. We'll be neutrally mapping out all the concepts presented in these pages, really digging into exactly what is being asked of the believers here. So, our source material today is a volume of messages supposedly channeled from higher spiritual beings, and our focus is strictly on Chapter 2, which was actually recorded back on December 7th, 2019. Within these pages, we find some profound and honestly surprisingly urgent critiques about organizational theology, the current state of the followers, and the absolute non-negotiable need for aggressive spiritual defense. To navigate all this complex theology, we're going to follow a pretty clear progression. First, Yaidron as the guardian of the Lord. Second, the vulnerability of believers. Third, the right defensive attitude. Fourth, overcoming core spiritual illusions. And finally, number 5, achieving sharpness and mobility. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Yaidron, guardian of the Lord. For a little context, the doctrine in our source outlines Yaidron not just as your, typical angel or guide. No, he's presented as a fiercely uncompromising cosmic protector, operating from this vast extraterrestrial perspective. According to the text, his entire existence and mission revolves around acting as the ultimate vanguard and shield for the supreme deity of this movement, El Cantare. So, this cosmic framing, it's really meant to elevate the stakes of his message from just simple moral advice to a literal universal imperative. Looking at the original transcripts, they reveal that Yaidron is continually intercepting evil entities and fending off these spiritual attacks aimed at the organization's leader, who, by the way, is seen as the earthly incarnation of that supreme deity. So Yaidron's role is basically a constant, heavy-duty shield against unseen negative forces. He is right there in the trenches of unseen spiritual warfare. And, as we're about to see, he entirely expects the human followers to join him down there. Which brings us to Section 2, the vulnerability of believers. So, Yaidron perceives a really critical weakness in the current state of the believers. When addressing the religious organization known as Happy Science, he states plainly, he doesn't sugarcoat it, that the group has not yet become an organization that actually protects the Lord. He sees a stark vulnerability here and addresses it with startling directness. This quote right here really captures the core of his frustration. He severely critiques the members for prioritizing this gentle, almost naive kind of love. And sure, while love is generally a huge virtue in religion, Yaidron argues that right here, right now, it's actually become a liability. He states they are completely lacking in what he terms sacred anger. That's a fierce, totally necessary, and righteous defense against hostile forces trying to undermine their faith and their leader. He goes on to amplify this critique, stating the organization is just entirely too optimistic. The source text literally describes them as being extremely complacent and living in a defenseless situation. By focusing only on self-preservation and internal peace, Yaidron claims they're basically leaving the front door wide open to both spiritual interference from evil spirits and real-world opposition from global forces. What Yaidron is demanding here is a massive paradigm shift. He wants followers to break out of this passive, weak state of mere self-preservation and transition into a highly active, bold defense. They're being called to adopt a militant spiritual posture, where protecting their doctrine and their leader is absolutely paramount. It's a complete 180. Let's move right along to Section 3, the right defensive attitude. In a Q&A section of the text that addresses the proper attitude of a believer, Yaidron describes his own methods. He says he strikes evil forces from the heavens with a flash of lightning. To combat all that extreme complacency we just talked about, Yaidron asserts that believers have to unite their doctrinal knowledge with decisive, courageous action. They need to mirror his intense, forceful methods in their own earthly endeavors if they want to build any real-world influence against opposing forces. Further explaining the source of his strength, Yaidron uses a really grounded metaphor that I find super interesting. He compares his relentless spiritual protection to an ER doctor, an emergency medical physician grabbing tiny, brief naps while constantly being targeted and remaining on super high alert. His uncompromising strength stems from this cosmic perspective on extraterrestrial missions, essentially treating spiritual threats as urgent, life-or-death emergencies. And he expects the movement's leaders to adopt that exact same level of hypervigilant urgency. This naturally leads us into Section 4, overcoming core spiritual illusions. In another Q&A segment, Yaidron explains that believers are currently trapped by internal barriers. The doctrine actually refers to this as needing to break through the walls of this world. Basically, Yaidron insists that before they can even think about effectively defending the organization, the disciples must undergo a really strict and unyielding internal spiritual reform. And he issues some highly specific directives here. He says true leadership and defense are totally impossible as long as followers harbor fundamental doubts, which, by the way, the text identifies as one of the major earthly desires. They also have to eradicate false views that cloud their judgment. Essentially, they have to completely overcome their basic human instinct for self-preservation if they want to truly grasp and boldly convey the true intentions or the true heart of their supreme deity. Finally, let's look at Section 5, achieving sharpness and mobility. Here, Yaidron explicitly calls for those in charge to stop resting on their laurels. He points out that way too many people are just coasting in their respective positions. He demands they take on a significantly higher level of responsibility to actually solve real-world problems. This isn't just a minor tweak, it is a demand for a total operational overhaul from top to bottom. By following these precise steps outlined in the doctrine, Yaidron claims the entire movement can transform. The ultimate goal? To evolve from a passive group into a spiritually tough, highly agile, and razor-sharp force. The text frames its evolution as absolutely necessary, not just for the survival of the group itself, but to make them capable of responding to unseen spiritual warfare, as well as the escalating global crises happening right here in the physical world. So as we wrap up this explainer, we really have to look at the broader implications of these fascinating source materials. We have to ask ourselves, if a religious movement successfully adopts this militant theological posture, trading gentle passivity for sacred anger and extreme vigilance, how does that translate into physical action? How might a doctrine demanding sharp, mobile, and uncompromising defense completely reshape an organization's real-world influence, especially when they view global crises as actual spiritual battlegrounds? It is a really profound question about the intersection of internal theology and external action, and I'll leave you to ponder it. Thanks so much for joining me in breaking down this material today.
Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something truly fascinating and highly specific. We're unpacking Chapter 3 of a channeled text by Ryuho Okawa, where he claims to channel the spirit of the ancient deity Toth. Now, whether you're well-versed in new religious movements or you're just curious about global sociology, our goal today is to neutrally deconstruct the unique and, frankly, politically charged claims made in this text. We're going to look at exactly how this specific spiritual framework interprets modern geopolitical crises, environmentalism, and major societal shifts. It is quite the wild ride of alternative perspectives, so let's get right into it.
Okay, so here is the source material we're examining today. A book titled Jesus, Yaidron, God, Thoth, Spirit Messages. And before we go any further, I really want to establish our extreme impartiality here. We are simply analyzing the text's esoteric interpretations of modern geopolitics. We are not here to endorse these views, nor are we here to validate them. We're just acting as your guide through the material, exploring how this particular spiritual lens views the modern world. Honestly, it's an incredible case study in how religious texts attempt to make sense of incredibly complex, contemporary global issues.
To keep us on track, we've got 6 distinct themes on the agenda today. First up, the summoning of Thoth. Second, views on global warming. Third, the Hong Kong Revolution. Fourth, spiritual perspectives on LGBT. Fifth, the Middle East question. And finally, the future of the Koreas.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the summoning of Toth.
To really understand these messages, we first need to set the scene. This specific session was recorded on October 5, 2019, up in Canada, right on the eve of a major lecture. According to the text, Toth, who is historically known as an ancient Atlantean leader and an Egyptian deity, is summoned here specifically as a North American god. He's called upon to deliver spiritual warnings regarding modern societal decay and political movements. The author basically positions Toth as this supreme observer of human history, someone bringing an ancient, eagle-eye perspective to the very modern problems of the 21st century.
Moving right along to Section 2, views on global warming.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that the text immediately tackles one of the most pressing issues of our time, but it presents a completely reversed view on climate change compared to the global consensus. On the left, we've got the mainstream view, right, that carbon dioxide is a harmful pollutant driving catastrophic warming. But look over on the right. Toth's channeled message portrays higher CO2 levels as an absolutely essential plant nutrient. The text argues that increased CO2 will actually lead to the greening of deserts, like those in Africa and the Middle East, and open up brand new agricultural possibilities in freezing places like the Russian tundra. It essentially claims that the Earth has this natural built-in self-purification and balancing mechanism, and that the current spike in CO2 is historically negligible if you compare it to, say, ancient volcanic eruptions. Furthermore, the text categorizes modern climate alarmism, what it calls the back to nature movement, as a disguise for left-wing economic control. It literally equates extreme environmentalism with a direct path to Marxism. The book even explicitly states that political leaders who are skeptical of international climate regulations, and it specifically names figures like Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, are correct in their resistance. It's a truly fascinating look at how political conservatism and environmental skepticism are entirely wrapped up into this specific spiritual theology.
All right, let's pivot to Section 3, the Hong Kong Revolution.
So, looking at Asian geopolitics, we really have to remember the context. This text was recorded right in the absolute heat of the 2019 Hong Kong protests. And the text poses a really critical question. What happens if the Hong Kong Revolution fails? The author channels a deep, deep anxiety about the expansion of unchecked totalitarianism and modern surveillance states, warning that the stakes in Hong Kong extend way, way beyond the city's borders.
And this brilliantly illustrates Toth's perspective. He points out that democratic movements in the region have actually been active for decades, but they are consistently suppressed and framed merely as riots by the authorities. The text compares the situation in Hong Kong directly to the marginalized struggles we've seen in Inner Mongolia and Tibet. The central argument here is kind of like a domino effect. If human rights and the fire of freedom in Hong Kong are ignored by the rest of the world, it's going to allow a highly advanced totalitarian surveillance system to simply sweep across the rest of Asia.
Section 4, spiritual perspectives on LGBT.
Now, as we report on the book's highly controversial and intensely traditionalist stance on sexuality, we're going to maintain our strict neutrality. According to the text, radical sexual movements and the modern push for LGBT rights are categorized as a distortion of the natural order. The book explicitly labels these movements as a variant of materialism and a rebellion against God. The channeled entity argues that identifying purely by one's physical or sexual desires totally ignores the spiritual reality of the soul. It frames these modern social movements as being driven by animalistic values that completely disregard God's eyes and the divine overarching purpose of human existence.
The author draws a very sharp line here between extreme hedonism and spiritual devotion. The text cautions heavily against the degradation of the soul that allegedly comes from chasing endless physical pleasure and dismantling traditional moral frameworks. However, it's really interesting to note that the book does not condemn celibacy. In fact, it specifically states that dedicating one's pure, celibate life to God, much like monks or nuns do, is entirely acceptable and spiritually valid. The critique is laser-focused on what the text perceives as a modern obsession with material bodily identity over spiritual duty.
Shifting gears completely, Section 5, the Middle East question.
Looking at the geopolitical and spiritual future of the Middle East, the text attempts to bridge a massive cultural divide. The central question posed here is, how does Thoth actually view the modernization of Islamic countries? Well, the text calls for a religious reformation of sorts, suggesting the need for a new Allah teaching that returns to foundational principles of peace, while still adapting to the realities of the modern world.
The book actually offers a surprisingly balanced, two-sided critique here. On one hand, it comes down hard on the West, claiming that Western godless democracy has become deeply arrogant, having lost its spiritual anchor to materialism and atheism. But on the other hand, it advises that Islamic nations must evolve into a more open society. It says they need to actively embrace tolerance, modernization, and specifically, women's rights. Notably, it also directly criticizes aggressive, individualistic military stances from leaders like Israel's Netanyahu, arguing that true lasting peace in the region simply cannot be achieved through brute military and economic force alone.
And finally, Section 6, Future of the Koreas.
Let's see how this builds an ultimate vision for East Asia by looking at the text's prophecies for this perpetual global hotspot. Toth asserts that the Korean crisis is fundamentally tied to regional hegemony. The prophecy expects a massive political upheaval in China, which will act as a major catalyst. Because of this coming shift, the text claims that the current authoritarian rule in North Korea simply cannot survive the 21st century. It's either going to collapse entirely or be forced to modernize. Consequently, the advice directed at South Korea is highly strategic. It warns South Korea to stop playing both sides and urgently reduce its economic reliance on Chinese trade in order to protect itself during this impending regional restructuring.
Well, we have definitely covered a lot of ground today. By synthesizing this anthology of Toth, we can see how this single explainer has navigated a wildly diverse array of global issues. I mean, we went from arguing that CO2 is a beneficial plant nutrient, to viewing the Hong Kong protests as a critical frontline against surveillance states, to framing modern sexuality as materialism, and finally predicting major sweeping shifts in the Middle East and the Koreas. The text attempts to create this unified theory of everything, filtering complex, secular geopolitics entirely through a highly specific supernatural framework.
So, the crucial question we're left with today is this: how do esoteric spiritual lenses reshape our understanding of modern political crises? Because, even if you reject every single claim made in this text, it still forces us to confront how supernatural belief shapes political reality for millions of people around the globe. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I'll see you next time.